Hello. Today we'd like to show you how to set up a Citrix Gateway for use with the Citrix Endpoint Management Service. The goal of this video is to show you the basic flow and architecture of a Citrix Endpoint Management Service leveraging a Citrix Gateway, also known formally as the Netscaler, for your on-prem service access. What we'd like to do is go over the requirements of the on-prem gateway, define the gateway settings in the Endpoint Management Service Cloud, or formerly XMS, show you how to leverage the export script that is provided from inside the cloud, so it allows you to script the configuration of your gateway on the Netscaler. So you've got to export that script from the service. We've got to show you how to edit that script to make sure that you put the proper configuration values, run the gateway script on the Netscaler itself, and then validate your configuration. So one of the big things to consider when you're setting up an environment and making the base connections work is understanding the traffic flow when a device enrolls. And so essentially on-prem, you need a Citrix Cloud Connector. And the Cloud Connector is designed to provide facilities for the Citrix Cloud services to talk to your on-prem resources. And this is typically back-end control plane traffic, authentication, etc. So when a device enrolls into the environment, Secure Hub will connect up on the device, talk to the endpoint management service in the cloud, and then when the user needs to authenticate with typically their Active Directory username and password, the Zen mobile service will make a call from the service to the Citrix Cloud backplane into the Cloud Connector to your Active Directory, for example. That is also used for situations where you want to send certificates, user certificates to a device, and that's typically out of a Microsoft CA, but there are others as well. And the idea is that the same connection, the Zen mobile server or endpoint management service, will connect up through the cloud, talk to the cloud connector, make a request to your PKI service, and return the certificate and pass it back to the device. And then also, if you're leveraging virtual apps and desktops, those same services are provided for the enumeration of the storefront of apps so that they show up in Secure Hub. Those calls are made through the cloud connector as well. It's important to note that that's enrollment management traffic, not client traffic. And so when you start talking about services like Secure Web or your custom application, it may be using the micro VPN. In that situation, it would be going through the Netscaler or Citrix Gateway, essentially. So a common misconception is that client data traffic would traverse through the cloud connector, and that's not the case. That's strictly for the management, like we talked about. When you get into your micro VPN using HTTPS connections to on-prem services, that is passing through your Citrix Gateway or Netscaler. So let's talk a little bit about traffic flow here. This is somewhat of a busy slide, but the idea here is that, when a device enrolls, the green device on the left there will be talking for MDM control traffic, will be talking to the cloud. But during enrollment and when you're using the micro VPN, what happens is for the MDM, that traffic goes directly to the cloud service. When you're doing MAM traffic, what you get is a connection to your gateway. And so in this situation, you need a public IP and a DNS name that will resolve. Typically, that connection is natted into the gateway itself. It doesn't have to be, but typically it is. So in this situation, we'll also need an SSL certificate. And so that SSL certificate needs to be a common name, or it can be a wildcard certificate, or even a SAN. But essentially, you have to have an SSL certificate, because if it's not a trusted certificate, the client will know that, and it will not allow the connection to happen. So then that brings up the gateway and the certificate, right? Obviously, this is where the traffic terminates when it comes into the Netscaler. So then when the device needs to actually validate that, hey, this is a trusted client, because in some situations you may be MAM only. And so the way the client talks is it talks to the gateway, authenticates itself, and then validates itself out on-prem. So if you were to look at this from a typical on-prem service, right, this load balancer allowed the service to be load balance across multiple Zen mobile nodes that would be on-prem. We have the same situation here, but we're actually going to traverse out to the cloud on port 843. And the idea here is that we are abstracting the host name in this load balancer so we can read IP and move things around in the service without it ever having required change on your side on the Netscaler. So at this point, the traffic then traverses to this, leaves the subnet IP or SNP of the Netscaler, and will go outbound to the cloud on port 8443. And this is a common area. I would say if we could eliminate firewall related issues and traffic paths getting out from the subnet IP out to the Citrix cloud on port 8443, typically 60-70% of the troubleshooting of Netscaler initial setup, those problems would go away, right? So just make sure you have those outbound communications, and Citrix support and cloud support services can actually give you the specific IPs if you have to have them. If you can just do it by firewall name, DNS name, that's even better. Then you'll also need an IP address for the management IP. And that's essentially allowing inbound traffic to be either SSH or web traffic through the web console, the Netscaler, to be able to manage that. But that's also the IP address that will make its calls out. For example, if you're using LDAP to use AD authentication for your gateway, then this traffic will leave the management IP and go out on port 389 or 636, typically to your LDAP servers, right? So important to know that, right, that traffic. So you'll need that open in some way to get through your firewall. And so when traffic comes into the gateway, if we step back and think about this from the standpoint of traffic entering your gateway, for just, let's say you've already enrolled, you've got your app, it's using a, maybe an embedded web browser or whatever it may be, and it talks to a web service, it will come into the gateway. And what the Netscaler does is it terminates that SSL session. And then it will route that traffic to the SNP and reestablish an SSL session outbound to your internal application on whatever port that may be. So in this situation, right, for generally your communication, you're going to need subnet IP access to whatever those backend resources. So that means opening up firewall ports. That's absolutely something you'll need to do. Now, there are options to use a proxy. You essentially have to set up traffic management profiles to say anytime traffic coming from this gateway is enumerating through this gateway, we need to tell it to go to this proxy. And then the benefit of that is, right, your normal web controls that you have around your enterprise protection of limiting access, the standard enterprise protocols that you're using and services and filters will all be applied by the proxy. And it gives you a single point coming in as opposed to having individual firewall rules for each individual application. And like we said, the admin console will need to be able to get to the Netscaler on port 443. So if you're looking at a customer that has a brand new deployment, right, that nothing is in place already, you'll need typically a VPX is what we use for trials. If you're a developer doing this and trying to stand this up on your own, then obviously you will get a VPX, but it can run on other physical or virtual appliances as well. So in that case, you would need, obviously the 4 IP address we talked about, the public IP address for the traffic coming in, the DNS name coming in so that it can resolve that name and get there. You'll need the public SSL certificate. You'll need the proxy load balancing IP, right? And that's typically a non-routable IP address, so the 10.192.168, et cetera, need to be defined there. That IP address is never seen off the Netscaler, since it's just a go-between between the interface coming in and the SNP. But you obviously don't want that IP address conflicting with something in DNS, for example, that would maybe resolving internally. So you need to try to find an IP address that's private, that's not in use. And then you'll need an LDAP service account, and that service account doesn't need any special permissions. We just use that service account to talk to Active Directory to validate credentials that may be passed from the client entering. So let's stop here and let's talk about the onboarding process. So the first thing we want to do is log into citrix.cloud.com and click on Manage under the Endpoint Management Service button. So now we're inside the Citrix Cloud console. We want to go to the Endpoint Management tile and click the Manage button. And what we want to do is go up to the gear in the upper right. And the idea here is we want to go in and make sure that LDAP is set up. If it's not set up first, then it won't be exported in our configuration script. So you just need to make sure it's there. If it's not there, add it. These come from your cloud connectors. We're using user principal name. So we want to set that to UPN as the search for the credential and go ahead and save it. And then we're going to go back and go into Citrix Gateway and now define what our gateway is going to be. So this alias, the AG, just is an alias. It will show up inside the Netscaler. We set our external URL that it will hit, save it as the default, and export the script. So now we're going to go to our folder where the zip is and just extract it. And what you notice is a readme.txt in here, and this just gives you a simple overview of the process that we're going to go through. So if you're a little confused what these files are, you've got an option here. You'll also notice there's a configure or clean up the Citrix Gateway script. So if you make a mistake, you can easily just open this and paste this script and paste the contents in your Netscaler, and it'll clean up everything you did. So most people will be using advanced policies, and so we're going to set that up here in our system. If you're setting up a new Netscaler, this is the version to use. Classic is for older Netscalers. So the first thing we do is set the gateway IP. And so if you're NATing through your firewall coming into this gateway interface, then this will be your NATed IP address, which is essentially what we're going to put in here. And we're just going to find all these values and search and replace all for them, because there's a few places for each of these settings where these values are used in the script. The proxy LB-VIP is essentially our MAM load balancing IP. This is our private IP address, non-routable internet IP. So I'm going to use a 10.0.0.2. Go ahead and set that up here. The next thing is the LDAP service username. This is typically the SAM account name portion of for the user. I'm just going to put my test username in here and replace all. And then the password. This is just a test password. It's not a real one. I'm going to clean this up later in our setup, but just for security reasons, I'm going to show you what the actual password is. But you would obviously put your real password here. Inside the Netscaler config, that would be encrypted. The next thing is the server certificate name. And this is essentially the SSL certificate name on your Netscaler that would be used on the gateway interface. So now what we want to do is make sure that we have our certificates from our bundle on the Netscaler. So we're going to do is SCP the .pim files onto the Netscaler into the /nsconfig/SSL folder, because our script will be expecting these certificates to be in that location, so we need to make sure they're there first. So now what we want to do is just SSH to the Netscaler and essentially paste our config commands into the CLI. So we'll just paste the values in here. And now what we want to do is just scroll up while this is saving and just verify that there are no errors. There are a few errors that you'll see in mine here when it runs, because I had already set this up just for testing and cleanup, and I missed a couple of things here. So you'll see that first rule there, and then the two certificates that we imported in the system, we've copied those onto the Netscaler, so into that directory, so they already exist. So the next thing we do is go into our load balancing DNS and make sure that our name servers are specified here. If you don't have DNS and servers set up in here, as well as suffixes for your internal networks, right, those need to be defined here as well. If they're not set up, then obviously you won't be able to resolve. One thing you'll notice here is my site name is autopro.xm.cloud.com. That is the pointing, so when the traffic comes in, we make sure that it hits the load balancer. So important that be there. So then we're going to go into our load balancing virtual servers and just make sure everything is up. Now, if your service weren't to be up, potentially you want to make sure that your virtual service binding, so this is what's pointing out to the cloud, and if there's no IP or it's 000, you either have an access issue or DNS is not functioning properly on your Netscaler. So important that be there and functional. You notice that our certificate is here, right? If the certificate didn't get applied, then the service would not be green, it would be red, and obviously would not be up. So the next thing we do is we're going to go into Citrix Gateway and just check some basic settings. Typically these will be correct, but if you're having a problem, allowed domains here is critical. That should be your site name :8443. So make sure that's there. The next is go into virtual servers and make sure that our gateway is here. Notice the STA status is green and the state is up, which means essentially for the most part our service is in good shape. We need to make sure our SSL certificate is applied, the same one with the same name we imported. My deployment is only using UPN, so I'm going to remove the SAM account name, and I'm going to check some settings in the server here. So what you'll notice here is this just filled in the bolins.com domain name here, but in some organizations that DNS record doesn't work, so I added ad.bolins.com as my actual DNS name for my domain controller, and resetting the password here for the sake of security to make sure all this stuff works. I'm going to go ahead and run test here. So this is down showing it's not up because my domain controller actually isn't running at the moment, but in general, typically that will connect. Notice I said to use user principal name, so the login attribute is UPN. And we're going to go ahead and click save and close. And the next thing we want to do is go down and just make sure that our site name with the 8443 port is defined there. Make sure the STOS server is green and up. If this isn't up, it means your load balancer typically has a misconfiguration or can't get out to the cloud on port 8443. The next thing we want to do is go into our session policies, and the only one that's really used here is PLOS, right? And this one's essentially what endpoint management uses. And what we want to do is turn off forced timeout. This just makes it where the activity coming through our gateway is activity-based and not just automatically being killed. And so what you'll see here is this is where you define is split tunnel on or off, right? So is it just corporate traffic going through the tunnel, or is everything? The session timeout here is typically set up to match the forced timeout, but this is set to a day essentially, and basically as long as the client is communicating through the gateway within 24 hours, it will keep the session up. The other thing to look at here is split DNS, and it's kind of interesting. This means from the position or perspective of the client. So remote would mean only use the Netscaler to resolve, where both would mean use the carrier and the Netscaler. So depending on your config, that may be something you want to change. Typically this will be filled in for you, but just as a critical thing, sometimes people come in and mess around with things and the account service address is misconfigured. Again, it should be your URL:8443. So we'll go ahead and do that and click done, and our gateway is now up and configured.